the previous trail leaves us inside the machinery of classification itself, in the space where words decide what can be seen. And before those categories begin to shift or collapse into new terms, there is a quieter moment preserved in older tablets, when the name is still written plainly, without apology, and without the need for explanation. In those early records, the Anunnaki do not enter as a mystery. They appear as an administrative certainty of the sacred world, placed into sequences, invoked in set phrases, and treated as a known body whose presence could be relied upon. The earliest environments that hold them most clearly are not grand royal monuments, and not the polished inscriptions meant for public display. Their most consistent appearances come from the tablets that behave like instructions, ritual compositions, incantations, lamentations, and procedural texts that tell a priest or a singer what must be said, and in what order, when the world is unsettled. These are documents that assume the listener is already trained. They do not argue for the existence of the Anunnaki. They simply file them into the work of restoring balance. In many of these compositions, the Anunnaki are not portrayed as a single personality or leader, but as a collective. The texts treat them as a group that can be summoned, addressed, or named among other divine bodies. Sometimes they are described as seated in an assembly, sometimes as those who render decision, and often as those who remain in places that do not move with the seasons of human life. Their location in the underworld is not always stated as a dramatic descent, but as a stable fact of cosmology. They belong to the part of the universe where judgment is permanent and where the dead must be accounted for. A scribe did not need to explain why such beings mattered. They mattered because they were part of the structure that kept the universe ordered. There are tablets where their name appears alongside the familiar underworld figures, Nergal and the scribal god who knows the destinies. In these passages, the Anunnaki are not explorers of the surface world. They are those who receive, those who weigh, those who sit behind the threshold. Their function resembles an institution more than a character. A ritual might say that offerings are presented to the Anunnaki, not because the Anunnaki are hungry, but because the underworld requires proper handling. The dead must be fed, appeased, or at least formally acknowledged. The Anunnaki are part of that procedural language. They are the divine recipients who make a rite complete. This kind of appearance can be seen in texts associated with funerary care and the management of restless spirits. Mesopotamian thought did not treat death as a clean severing. The dead required continuing attention, and the living carried responsibilities that were both familial and legal. A neglected spirit could become a source of disorder. In these contexts, the Anunnaki are often invoked not as a terror, but as a stabilizing body. Their role is implied through their position. They belong to the domain that governs what happens what ordinary jurisdiction ends. Their name functions almost like an address written on a document, directing words and offerings to the proper office. And because these are scribal documents, the formula matters. The Anunnaki appear in recurring patterns, in lines that are repeated across generations of copying. The consistency is significant. A scribe did not improvise divine lists lightly. Lists imply established hierarchy. When the Anunnaki are placed among other gods, it suggests that the scribal community agreed on their rank and function well enough to preserve it. In that sense, the earliest mention of the Anunnaki is not an origin story. It is the trace of a stable system already in operation, already inherited. The same clarity appears in certain compositions that describe a divine council. The Anunnaki are sometimes portrayed as those who convene, those who deliberate, those who render verdicts. These scenes resemble legal procedure more than mythic drama. A complaint is brought, a decision is issued, a destiny is fixed. The central action is not heroism. It is authorization. The gods assemble as if the world requires governance in the same way cities do. This is not a later scholarly projection. The tablets themselves often use language of decree, judgment, and the setting of fates. In these texts, to say that the Anunnaki are present is to say that the ruling body is complete. There is a quiet difference here from the language used for major temple gods like Enlil or Inanna. Those gods are frequently attached to cities, temples, rituals of public festival. They appear in hymns meant for performance, in royal inscriptions meant to be seen. The Anunnaki, by contrast, often appear in the internal texts, those used by specialists, those kept in archives, those copied in scribal schools. Their sphere is not the street or the courtyard, but the threshold, the assembly, the underworld tribunal. Their presence is documented through the work of those who managed sacred procedure, not through proclamations. This matters because it places their disappearance into a particular kind of visibility. If the Anunnaki belong primarily to ritual and underworld language, then their absence in later public royal texts might not mean that belief ended. It may mean that the visibility of their name depended on the survival of certain genres and the authority of certain institutions. When ritual language is reorganized, when priestly schools shift curricula, when archives collapse or are overwritten, the names that belong to that ritual framework can become less frequent without any dramatic change in the underlying cosmology. The earliest tablets also show something else. The Anunnaki are not always fixed as benevolent or hostile. They are not written as villains, nor as saviors. They are written as necessary. Their presence is part of the world's filing system. In an incantation, they may be called upon to restrain a spirit. In a lament, they may be described as those who have decreed suffering. In a ritual, they may be recipients of offerings that allow a boundary to close properly. Each case implies that the Anunnaki are not defined by emotion, but by office. They do not need personality because their function is structural. And yet, even in these early texts, where their name is clear, there is already a hint of instability. The scribes sometimes alternate between terms. In one tablet, a group of great gods performs a role that elsewhere belongs to the Anunnaki. In other compositions, a different divine body appears in the same seat of authority. The Anunnaki are not absent, but they are not alone. The archival record suggests overlapping jurisdictions, multiple ways to name the same structure, multiple words for divine assemblies depending on context, dialect, or school tradition. This creates a subtle problem for the investigator. If a later tablet stops using the term Anunnaki, the shift may not be theological at all. It may reflect a scribal preference, or a regional tradition, or the dominance of a particular library. The disappearance might be a matter of terminology rather than presence. The gods themselves, as the scribes understood them, might still occupy the same roles. Only the name written on the tablet changes in that sense. The early clarity of the Anunnaki is not the beginning of a story, but the beginning of an archive. Their name appears most cleanly where scribes are preserving procedures that are older than any single dynasty. The tablets suggest a world where divine governance is already established, already inherited, and already bureaucratically stable. The Anunnaki sit within that inherited structure like a council whose authority is assumed, not explained, But if their role was so institutionally embedded, so tied to the deep architecture of ritual and judgment, then the later quieting of their name becomes more puzzling, not less. If a culture continues to perform rites for the dead, continues to speak of destiny, continues to imagine the universe as governed by decree, why would the scribes gradually choose other terms, other assemblies, other divine titles in the written record? What exactly changes first? The gods, the language, or the institutions that preserved their names? The question at the end of the previous chapter lingers in a very narrow space, not in the heavens, not in the underworld, but on the surface of the tablet itself. If the Anunnaki are present most clearly when the archive is stable, then the first place to look for their disappearance is not in theology, but in the habits of classification. The scribes did not simply record a universe. They sorted it, and the names of divine groups, like the names of professions or cities, could change depending on the logic of the archive. In the cuneiform record, the words that modern readers translate as Anunnaki do not behave like an ordinary proper noun. They often appear in plural forms, or as collective terms, and in some contexts, the same group is referred to by slightly different spellings or related expressions. This is not accidental. Sumerian and Akkadian scribes worked within a multilingual environment where many divine names could be written logographically, syllabically, or through combinations of signs that carried older meanings. A single term could function as a title, a category, or an inherited label whose original sense was already distant. When a scribe wrote the Anunnaki, the act was not simply naming beings. It was placing a set of beings into a system. One of the earliest terms related to the Anunnaki is Anina, or Anina, often associated with the idea of princely or noble gods. The phrase is frequently translated as something like the princely offspring or the seed of Anu, though the precise sense is not always secure. In practice, the term operates as a collective, a group of high-ranking gods, whose identity is defined less by individual personalities and more by their position in the divine hierarchy. In certain compositions, Anina appears as an established body that can assemble, decree destinies, or be invoked as witnesses. In those texts, the word functions in the same way a title might function in a court record. It signals rank, not individuality, but then another form appears, Anunnaki, particularly in Akkadian contexts and in later textual corpora. It is tempting to assume this is simply the same word carried forward, yet the shift matters. The suffix and phonetic rendering indicate not only linguistic change, but scribal convention. Anunnaki becomes the form that later scholarship and popular culture recognize, but the tablets themselves present a more complex situation. In some contexts, Anuna and Anunnaki seem interchangeable, while in others they occupy slightly different functions, one more strongly linked to the assembly of high gods, the other more closely tied to underworld authority. The distinction is not always consistent, which is precisely the point. These terms are categories that can overlap, not fixed species. Scribal classification systems often allowed such overlap. A god could belong to a city, a temple, a lineage, and a function all at once. A divine group could be defined by location in the cosmos, by kinship, by rank, or by ritual role. The term great gods is an example of a category that can absorb other categories. It appears in hymns, royal inscriptions, and ritual texts, sometimes functioning as a broad label for the highest tier of divinities. When a tablet calls upon the great gods, it is often performing a gesture of completeness. as if ensuring that no authority is left unaddressed. In such cases, the Anunnaki may still be present as part of that group, but they are no longer singled out. The disappearance becomes a matter of vocabulary choice. The archive shifts toward broader, less specific collective terms. Another category often discussed alongside the Anunnaki is the Ajiji in later Akkadian literature. The Ajiji are frequently described as the gods of heaven, sometimes contrasted with the Anunnaki as the gods of the underworld. This division appears especially clearly in certain mythological narratives, where the Ajiji occupy the upper realm and the Anunnaki the lower. Yet even here, the categories function flexibly. The Ajiji sometimes appear as a divine workforce, a collective group whose actions represent the will or unrest of the heavenly realm. The term can function as a label for the gods above in a way that parallels Anunnaki as the gods below, but the line is not always drawn with the same precision across texts. What matters is that none of these categories is necessarily a statement of biology, identity, or even stable membership. They are ways of sorting, and the scribes who sorted them were trained in schools where lists were central. Lists of signs, lists of professions, lists of cities, lists of offerings, lists of gods. These lists were not passive inventories. They were frameworks that shaped reality. When a scribe learned to write the names of gods in a particular order, the order itself became part of the world's structure. Categories were reinforced through repetition, through copying, through the physical act of pressing a stylus into clay in the sequence that tradition demanded. The divine lists themselves are crucial evidence. Some list texts organize gods by genealogy, placing Anu and Enlil at the top, then descending through lines of divine descent. Others organize gods by function storm gods, healing gods, underworld gods, while others arrange them by city and temple. In one kind of list, the Annona may appear as a category at the top, representing the major gods as a whole. In another, the Anunnaki may appear as a group within the underworld section, and in yet another, they may not appear at all. Not because they have vanished, but because the list uses a different organizing principle. This means that the disappearance of the Anunnaki can be approached as a scribal phenomenon. If a later period prefers city-based theology, where divine authority is anchored in specific cult centers, then broad collective categories may become less useful. If a dynasty emphasizes a particular god Enlil in one era, Marduk in another, the language of inscriptions may shift toward that god's court, that god's lineage, that god's allies. The Anunnaki, as a collective category, may become absorbed into the broader phrase, the great gods, or into the entourage of a major deity, or into the background assumptions of cosmology that no longer require explicit mention. There is also the matter of writing systems. Cuneiform was not a single alphabetic script with fixed spellings. It was a complex system of signs that could carry multiple readings. A scribe could write a divine name with a logogram inherited from Sumerian tradition, even when writing Akkadian. The same sign could be read in different ways depending on context. This allowed continuity, but it also allowed subtle shifts. A term could remain visually similar on the tablet while changing in spoken form, or conversely could change in writing while remaining conceptually similar. When modern readers search for the Anunnaki, they often search for a specific spelling, but the archive itself contains variants that may not be immediately recognized without philological care. Even the determinative sign for divinity, the small superscript, marker indicating God, participates in the classification. It separates divine names from human names, but it also signals that what follows is part of a recognized sacred register. When a group term like Anunnaki carries that determinative, it reinforces the idea that the category itself is treated as divine. But sometimes group terms appear without it, or with different grammatical behavior, suggesting that the scribes did not always treat them as a fixed group of gods so much as a description of rank. In such cases, the term functions almost like an adjective, those of noble divine status, rather than a specific council with a fixed membership list. If this is true, then the Anunnaki's fading from prominence might be the result of a gradual shift toward more specific naming toward individual gods tied to temples and political legitimacy rather than an erasure. A scribe writing a royal inscription may prefer to name Enlil-Ninurta or the city god who grants kingship, because those names carry immediate political meaning. The Anunnaki, being a broad collective, may not serve the purpose of royal propaganda, yet in ritual archives, where completeness matters, they may persist longer. The change is not uniform across the archive. It depends on genre. The scribes themselves understood this. Their work depended on knowing which terms belonged in which context. A lamentation singer did not use the same divine categories as an accountant. A temple administrator did not invoke the same collective names as an exorcist. The universe was sorted differently depending on the task. In this sense, divine categories are not only theological, they are practical, and this returns us to the investigative problem. If the Anunnaki are a category that can be replaced by another category, if they can be folded into great gods, contrasted with Agigi, or expressed through earlier forms like Ananna, then their disappearance may not require any dramatic event. It may simply require the slow motion of scribal preference, a curriculum that changes, a dominant dialect, a shifting theology of kingship, a new archive that copies certain lists and neglects others. But if the Anunnaki were, at least in some early texts, treated as a specific council with a specific jurisdiction, particularly in the underworld and in the fixing of destinies, then a lingering question remains. At what point does a category stop being actively invoked and become merely assumed? And what happens to a civilization's sense of cosmic authority when its oldest councils begin to fade into the background of its own language? The last question does not demand an answer so much as it demands a place to stand. If categories can fade into assumption, then the next evidence must be found where assumptions are least tolerated, where authority is rendered visible, and where decisions are written into the world as if into a ledger. In Mesopotamian records, that place is often an assembly, not an assembly in the modern sense of a crowd, but a formal gathering of powers, convened to adjudicate, to allocate, to decree. When the tablets describe the Anunnaki acting together, they most often describe them in this administrative posture, seated, deliberating, issuing outcomes that cannot be revised. These scenes do not read as ornament. They read like procedure. In certain compositions, preserved in scribal libraries, the gods do not merely speak, they convene. They take positions, receive petitions, and pronounce decisions. The writing treats the assembly as an institution with protocols that resemble the structures of city governance. The gods are not described as wandering freely through a landscape of myth. They appear as office holders, arranged in rank, bound to a system of consensus and decree. The Anunnaki within this system function as a collective authority. Their presence signals that the highest court has been constituted. What is striking is how often the assembly is described through the language of seating. The gods sit. They sit in councils. They sit in the place of judgment. They sit to determine fate. The emphasis is not on action, but on arrangement. The act of sitting implies permanence and jurisdiction. A god who sits is not simply resting. They occupy a position. The imagery is administrative before it is poetic. It implies an order in which decisions are not spontaneous, but processed in some narratives. The Anunnaki appear explicitly as the body that fixes destinies. The phrase "to decree the fates" belongs to the vocabulary of administration. Fate in this sense is not mysticism. It is assignment. It is the allocation of roles, the setting of boundaries, the determination of outcomes. The Anunnaki, as an assembly, do what councils do. They make the world predictable by authorizing it. Their decrees hold because they are issued collectively, and because they emerge from a recognized hierarchy. The parallels with human governance are difficult to ignore, though they must be approached carefully. Mesopotamian cities were not governed by solitary rulers alone. They were governed through layers, temple households, councils of elders, assemblies of citizens in earlier periods, and later by courts and bureaucratic officials attached to palace and temple. Decisions were made through consultation, sealed by witnesses, and enforced through institutions. The written record itself, with its contracts and legal disputes, is evidence of a society that believed authority needed to be documented. In that context, it makes sense that the divine world is also presented as a documented authority structure. The Anunnaki's role as a court becomes especially clear in texts where complaint and judgment are formalized. A disruption occurs often framed as a disorder in the land, a transgression or a breach of cosmic balance, and the solution is not immediate violence but deliberation. The gods gather. The case is presented. The verdict is issued. This is the language of litigation, not adventure. The divine assembly is a mirror of what scribes knew. Disputes require hearing. Decisions require witnesses. Outcomes require authorization. And yet, the assembly is not always located in one place. This is where the assembly that moved becomes an important clue. In older Sumerian contexts, the divine council is sometimes associated with certain cosmic or underworld locations. But later, Akkadian literature can portray assemblies convening in different realms depending on the problem at hand. The court can meet in the heavens, on earth, or below. The assembly is not tied to a single building. It is mobile because authority is mobile. Wherever the question of order arises, the council can be convened. That mobility resembles something familiar in human administration as well. Early city authority is strongly attached to place, the temple precinct, the city gate, the council hall. Later, state authority becomes less dependent on a single local setting and more dependent on offices that can travel with the king, the army, or the bureaucracy. A palace administration can operate across regions. A royal court can sit wherever the ruler sits. In the records, the language of judgment and decree travels outward as political structures centralize. The question, then, is whether divine councils in literature reflect this same historical motion. This is not an easy claim to make, because the textual record is not a straightforward mirror. Many of the compositions we possess were copied in later periods, sometimes centuries after their earliest forms. A tablet from a late scribal school can preserve a much older story. But even copying is a historical act. When scribes choose what to copy and how to copy it, They shape the presentation of divine authority in ways that correspond to their own world. The divine assembly, even if inherited, is always being republished. Within this shifting landscape, the Anunnaki can appear as both stable and adaptable. In some texts, they are the immovable underworld court, the long-seated judges beneath the earth. In others, they appear as part of a larger divine parliament, convened to address crises that affect the upper world. This flexibility suggests that the Anunnaki are not merely a mythic remnant. They are a functional category of authority, capable of being deployed in different narrative jurisdictions. The administrative nature of the assembly is also suggested by the repeated emphasis on unanimity and collective decision. A single god may propose, but the council ratifies. The power is not merely individual. It is institutional. This is how bureaucracies maintain legitimacy. Decisions are not presented as personal whims, but as the outcome of recognized procedure. When the Anunnaki are present, it implies procedural legitimacy. When they are absent, it implies that legitimacy has been sourced elsewhere. This becomes more visible when we place divine councils alongside the rise of kingship ideology. In the earliest political traditions, kingship is often portrayed as something that descends from heaven, allocated by divine authority. Later inscriptions and royal hymns increasingly emphasize the king's special relationship with a specific god, often a city god or a dynastic patron. Authority narrows. It becomes more centralized. Rather than a broad council of gods authorizing the order of the land, a single divine patron might become the primary sponsor of a dynasty's legitimacy. In such a context, a large council like the Anunnaki may still exist, but it may no longer be rhetorically necessary to mention. A similar narrowing can occur in legal and administrative practice. In early Mesopotamian city life, multiple institutions share power: temple and palace, councils and households. Over time, royal administrations become more assertive. They develop more standardized procedures, more officials, more record-keeping. Authority becomes less distributed. If divine assemblies reflect this political evolution, then the Anunnaki's role might shift as well. They might become a background court, invoked only in specific ritual contexts, while everyday legitimacy is carried by more immediate divine and royal relationships. This is the key scholarly problem that the assembly scenes introduce. Are these divine councils primarily inherited cosmology, repeated for tradition's sake? Or do they evolve as the state evolves, quietly reconfigured by scribes who were themselves embedded in changing systems of governance? If the answer is the latter, then the disappearance of the Anunnaki might not be a disappearance at all. It might be an administrative reorganization, an internal restructuring of authority in the divine archive, paralleling the restructuring of authority in the human state. But if divine councils can move, reassemble, and be expressed through different names and configurations, then the question becomes more precise. At what point does the divine court stop appearing as a broad collective and start appearing as the entourage of a single high god or the authority of a single king? And what does that transition reveal about who, in Mesopotamia, was allowed to govern the universe in writing? The last implication rests on a quiet fault line. Authority does not only shift in practice, it shifts in the way it is remembered. When the divine court begins to narrow toward a single patron or a single king, the change is not always announced. It is filed into the record as if it had always been that way. And this is where the investigation enters a different kind of archive, one that does not instruct a ritual or adjudicate a complaint, but instead attempts something far more delicate. It attempts to organize the entire past. Among the most revealing documents for this effort is the tradition modern scholarship calls the Sumerian king list. It survives not as a single tablet, but as a family of copies, written and rewritten across centuries, sometimes with regional variations and political emphases. The king list is not a chronicle in the modern sense. It is an arrangement. It is a statement that kingship is a transferable institution, moving from city to city according to a logic that is presented as orderly, even when the historical reality was not. Its central claim is simple and absolute in form. Even if not in fact, kingship descends, it resides, it moves, and it is continuous. The list begins before what it calls the flood. In that opening section, the rulers are not treated as ordinary men. Their reigns are written in spans that exceed ordinary human life, dozens of thousands of years, arranged with precision, as if the numbers themselves are part of the claim. These are not casual exaggerations. They are structured totals, written with the same sexagesimal logic used elsewhere for accounts and measures. In this way, the king list speaks the language of administration even while dealing with deep time. It treats the distant past as if it were a ledger that can be balanced. The pre-flood kings are assigned to specific cities: Eridu, Batibira, Lara, Sipar, Shurupak. These cities were real places, with archaeological remains, temple traditions, and later political significance. The king list anchors its deep time memory in the geography of Mesopotamia. It does not speak of an abstract golden age. It speaks of institutions, cities, thrones, lineages, and it insists that kingship already existed in those cities long before the flood. The implication is that civilization is not invented. It is received, already complete, already structured. The past is treated as inheritance, not experimentation. In this pre-flood section, the Anunnaki are not named. That absence is striking precisely because the era is described in a language of divine scale duration. If any period would seem to invite explicit mention of a primordial divine assembly, it would be this one. And yet the king list does not foreground divine councils. Instead, it foregrounds the institution of kingship itself. The text begins with the famous formula, "Kingship descended from heaven." It does not say which gods debated it, which assembly approved it, which divine group administered the transfer. The mechanism is condensed. The divine bureaucracy is implied rather than described. This condensation may be a clue. The king list does not function as ritual literature. It functions as political memory. Its purpose is not to depict the divine world in detail, but to establish legitimacy through continuity. The audience is not a priest preparing offerings. It is a ruler, a court, a scribal culture that needs a stable account of how authority moves. In that setting, it may be more effective to present kingship as a direct, heavenly institution than to describe the deliberations of a council like the Anunnaki. The list's authority depends on inevitability, not debate. It presents kingship as something that happens, not something that is decided. The flood itself is treated as an administrative break. The language does not linger. It does not narrate the catastrophe in detail. It functions as a dividing line, a reset marker in the archive. Then the flood swept over. After this, kingship descends again, and the list resumes, now with reign lengths that gradually approach human scale. The numbers remain large at first, but the direction is clear. Time becomes more familiar. The deep past becomes less divine and more historical. This gradual normalization of reign lengths is one of the king list's most revealing features. It suggests that the scribes did not simply invent a mythic past and then shift to history. They created a gradient. The list eases the reader from impossible durations into plausible ones. Civilization does not begin suddenly. It is always already there. What changes is the scale of time. And as time becomes more human, kingship becomes more firmly anchored in political realities, competing, dynasties rising and falling, regional power consolidating. It is in this transition that the question of the Anunnaki becomes sharper. If earlier ritual and underworld texts place the Anunnaki in the realm of fate and judgment, and if assembly scenes present them as a council authorizing order, why do the king list traditions rely instead on a formula of descent? Why does the archive of kingship choose to simplify divine authority rather than elaborate it? One possibility is that the king list represents a different kind of theological economy. Instead of presenting the divine world as a complex bureaucracy, it presents it as a single function. Kingship is bestowed. The details of who bestows it may have been considered unnecessary or even destabilizing. A council implies debate, and debate implies contingency. But the king list needs kingship to feel inevitable. It needs authority to appear clean, transferable, and continuous. The list's power lies in its refusal to show conflict in the divine realm. The political conflicts of the human realm are already difficult enough to manage. Another possibility is that the king list is evidence of a shift in focus. In many early Sumerian compositions, the gods and their assemblies are central actors. But in the king list, the gods recede into the background. The protagonists are kings. Even in the pre-flood section, where the reign lengths suggest superhuman status, the kings themselves are the primary units of meaning. The divine world is reduced to a single gesture at the beginning of each era. Kingship descends. This is not because the scribes no longer believed in divine councils. It may be because the scribes were building a new kind of record, one in which the divine is treated as the source of authority but not its ongoing administrator, the king. List also suggests that memory itself is curated. Different versions emphasize different dynasties. Some copies elevate the importance of certain cities. The text is not neutral. It is a document of political storytelling, constructed in the language of bureaucracy. It presents an inherited institution, but it also arranges inheritance to serve the present. This is precisely the kind of environment in which certain divine categories might fade not because they vanish from belief, but because they do not serve the rhetorical needs of kingship history. If the Anunnaki are a court, their presence implies accountability. Courts judge. Courts deliberate. Courts can condemn. But kingship ideology often requires not judgment but sanction. It requires a simple divine approval, not a complex divine process. The king list treats kingship as something that moves by divine decree, yet it does not show the courtroom where that decree is issued. The council is behind a curtain. Only the outcome is recorded, and so the pre-flood era may be where the Anunnaki begin to fade not, because they were absent from the earliest imagination, but because the archive that claims to contain the earliest history is designed to foreground kingship as the primary inheritance. The older divine institutions remain implicit, while the human institution becomes explicit, measurable, and traceable through cities and reigns. If this is how Mesopotamian historiography works, compressing divine complexity into a single formula, then the next question becomes difficult to avoid. When the record begins to treat kingship as the central inherited structure, does the divine court disappear from the writing because it is no longer necessary, or because the scribes are deliberately shaping the past into a form where only kings, not councils, can be remembered? The last question lingers inside the king list's quietest maneuver. It turns a complex universe into a single line of transfer. Kingship descends, the flood intervenes, kingship descends again. The council that might have debated the transfer is never shown, and the catastrophe that divides the eras is rendered as a brief administrative mark. The text gives the impression that history can be arranged with clean boundaries. But beneath those boundaries there is another archive, one that does not use signs or numbers, and cannot be edited by scribes. It is the archive of the ground itself, in several Mesopotamian sites. Excavators have found layers that interrupt ordinary occupation debris with something different: a band of clean silt, clay, or water-laid sediment that suggests flooding severe enough to deposit a new surface across a settlement. These layers vary in thickness and extent. They do not appear consistently at every site, and they do not align neatly into a single synchronizable event. But they share one characteristic that matters for the story. They are interruptions that cannot be explained by normal domestic activity. They are moments when the river or the plain, or the wider hydrological system asserted itself over human planning. The most famous example comes from the early 20th century excavations at York, where Leonard Woolley reported a thick layer of flood deposit beneath early dynastic levels. It was not a thin wash. It appeared as a substantial band, cleaner than the usual mixture of ash, brick, fragments, and refuse. Woolley interpreted it as evidence of a major flood that had swept across the region. Later, archaeologists have debated the extent of that event, and whether it represents one flood or an accumulation from multiple episodes. The important point is not the certainty of Woolley's conclusion, but the fact that the earth at Yor preserves a phase when occupation was interrupted by water in a way that left a visible signature in the STR-ATRG-RAPHY. Similar flood-related deposits have been identified at other sites associated with the king. Lists early geography Shoropic and the broader southern alluvium. At Shorpuk, excavators found evidence of a major flood horizon, and the site itself carries a weight of tradition because it appears in flood narratives and early textual memory. At Kish, flood deposits have also been reported, though the stratigraphic contexts differ and the dates do not line up perfectly with those at Shurupek or Yor. The pattern across these sites does not produce a single event that can be traced like a line on a map. It produces a landscape in which flooding is a repeated hazard, sometimes catastrophic enough to break settlement continuity. This is where archaeology complicates the textual division between before and after. The king list presents the flood as a single hinge, the kind of event that cleanly resets history. The ground suggests something less tidy, multiple episodes of destruction and rebuilding, some remembered, some not. Flooding in the Mesopotamian plain is not an anomaly. It is part of the environmental rhythm of rivers that shift course, overflow, and deposit new soil. The plain itself is built by such events. The archaeologist sees not a single interruption, but a series of negotiations between human settlement and unstable water systems. And yet, even if the flood layers do not confirm a single universal disaster, they do confirm something that matters for the archive. Sudden loss. When water sweeps through a settlement, it does not only destroy houses, it disrupts storage, displaces people, and erases the fragile infrastructure of record keeping. Tablets are not indestructible. Unfired clay can dissolve. Fired tablets can be broken and scattered. Archives can be buried, but they can also be washed away, redeposited, or contaminated. A flood is an event that changes what survives. This has consequences for the gods that remain visible in the record. The survival of divine names is tied to the survival of genres, and genres are tied to institutions. A temple archive that collapses may preserve a portion of its tablets under rubble, but another archive might be completely lost if its tablets were stored in a location reached by water. A scribal school might be rebuilt, but its earlier curriculum could be severed if teachers were displaced. In such circumstances, disappearance in the written record can be an effect of physical interruption, not theological change. A divine category that depended on specialist literature incantations, underworld rites. Scholastic lists might become rarer simply because the institutions that copied those texts suffered breaks in continuity. Flood layers also imply rebuilding. After a major inundation, the settlement's surface changes. New architecture is laid down on top of the deposit. Sometimes the rebuild is immediate. Sometimes it is delayed. In either case, rebuilding often entails reorganization. Property boundaries shift. Temple precincts may be redefined. Political authority may change hands if a city loses population or its agricultural base is disrupted. These are not abstract changes. They affect which temples receive offerings, which gods are emphasized, and which inscriptions are commissioned. Inscriptions, after all, are not written simply because the gods exist. They are written because someone has the resources and motivation to inscribe them. There is a quieter point as well. Flood deposits remind us that catastrophe can generate explanation. Societies that live with rivers build interpretive frameworks for water. Flooding becomes not only an environmental event, but a moral and administrative one. It invites questions of blame, appeasement, and cosmic order. But different texts answer those questions differently. In some traditions, major disruptions are explained through decisions made in divine assemblies. In others, the explanation is compressed into a formula. The flood swept over. Kingship descended again. Archaeology cannot tell us which story is correct. It can only show that the environment provides repeated occasions for such stories to emerge. If the Anunnaki appear most clearly in underworld procedure and divine court language, then one would expect them to become more prominent in times when disorder needs explanation. Yet the record may show the opposite, not because the Anunnaki were irrelevant, but because the genres that spoke their names were the most vulnerable to interruption. A catastrophe can simplify a tradition. In rebuilding, a society may privilege the most politically useful gods, the most publicly visible cults, the divine patrons tied to dynasties and city identity. Older collective councils, especially those embedded in specialist ritual texts, can retreat into the background if the chain of copying is broken. The flood layer, then, is not only a physical deposit. It is a reminder that the archive is selective by force, not just by intention. The earth interrupts the story, and the scribes must begin again on a new surface. In that beginning, they inherit what survived, not necessarily what once existed in full. If repeated floods and material breaks shape, which texts remain available to later scribes? Then the question of disappearance becomes less like theology and more like preservation. When the ground itself edits the archive, washing away some libraries and sealing others, what kinds of divine authority are most likely to be remembered, and which councils might fade simply because their tablets did not endure. The flood layer leaves behind more than a physical scar. It leaves behind a rebuilt surface where institutions must reassert themselves quickly, not only in brick but in routine. When the water recedes, survival is measured in tasks that can be counted, grain redistributed, labor organized, herds accounted for, offerings restored. In that restored rhythm, the most enduring documents are rarely narrative. They are administrative. They do not describe a cosmic catastrophe. They record who received barley, who owed work, who brought oil, who was present, who was absent. And within that world of account-keeping, the gods do not disappear. They become measurable. To enter a temple archive is to enter a kind of quiet universe where divinity is handled as part of management. Many of the earliest surviving tablets from southern-day Mesopotamias, from the late 4th and early 3rd millennium are not hymns or myths. They are lists. They record deliveries of grain and wool, allocations of beer, rations for workers, expenditures for festivals, counts of livestock. Temples appear not only as places of worship but as economic institutions with staff, storage, and predictable cycles of income and outflow. In these texts, the gods are not distant presences. They are the names at the top of the account. A typical administrative tablet may not describe a deity in any poetic sense. It might simply record that a certain amount of flour was issued for the offering of ninjutsu, or that a quantity of oil was set aside for the divine banquet, or that sheep were slaughtered for a specified festival day. The god's name functions like the name of a department. It indicates where resources belong and why they are being moved. The archive is not built to explore divine assemblies. It is built to ensure that the temple's obligations are met with precision. This is where the logic of quieting begins. The Anunnaki, as a collective council, are not easily handled by the accounting tablet. A temple administrator needs a recipient with a clear cult center, a clear calendar, and a clear set of officials responsible for the rite. A collective category may exist in theology, but it does not automatically translate into regular entries in a ration list. Temple archives are practical by necessity. They favor gods who have dedicated shrines, defined offerings, named priests, and routine obligations that can be scheduled and audited. The administrative record, therefore, produces a particular kind of divine visibility. Gods tied to major temples Enlil of Nippur, Ninjutsu of Lagash, Inanna of Uruk, Nana of Europea, repeatedly because their cults required constant provisioning. Offerings were not occasional gestures. They were institutional duties. Bread and beer were baked in predictable quantities. Animals were sacrificed in predictable cycles. Workers were assigned to tasks with predictable labels. The god becomes a node in an economic network. Their presence is reinforced not through narrative, but through repetition across thousands of tablets. In such an environment, broad collective councils are less likely to be named, not because they are denied, but because they are not operational units. The Anunnaki might be invoked in ritual texts that deal with underworld matters or fate decrees. But temple accounting is concerned with the surface world of labor and provision. It registers the gods as employers, landowners, and recipients. If the Anunnaki do not own fields under a single temple's control, if they do not have a singular cult statue in a storeroom, if they do not have a fixed festival day requiring a precise number of sheep, then the tablets that survive in large numbers will not be expected to mention them frequently. This is not hypothetical. The structure of temple administration encourages specificity. Many tablets are tied to individual festivals, the eating of bread ceremony, the New Year rites, processions, purification days. A festival belongs to a god and to a place. It requires ingredients and personnel, singers, brewers, herders, carpenters, oil pressers, reed workers. The administrative record will preserve these details because they must be managed. A divine assembly, even if central to theology, does not require barley rations in the same repetitive way. It is less administratively visible. Personnel lists reinforce this logic. Temples employed large staffs with specialized titles: priestly officials, overseers, craft workers, scribes, musicians, porters. Many were tied to specific deities. Their positions could be hereditary, and their duties could be recorded across generations. The existence of a priest of Enlil or a lamentation singer of Inanna is not merely a religious detail. It is an administrative fact. Such a title generates paperwork. It generates rations and allocations. The temple archive becomes, in effect, an index of which gods were anchored to institutions stable enough to employ staff. By contrast, we rarely encounter priests of the Anunnaki in the same systematic way. This absence itself is meaningful. It suggests that the Anunnaki, when invoked, belong to a different sphere of religious practice, one less centered on daily temple provisioning and more centered on occasional rites, scholarly recitation, or specialized underworld procedures. They might be present in the conceptual structure of the religion, but they are not necessarily attached to a single temple economy that produces mass. Documentation. The question of survival also matters. Administrative archives survive in enormous quantities because they were produced constantly. They were not rare. They were used, stored, and often discarded in ways that left them buried in buildings, thrown into fill, sealed into walls, or preserved in destruction layers. Their volume ensures that certain kinds of divine references dominate our evidence. The more an archive is dominated by accounting texts, the more our perception of divine life becomes dominated by administratively practical gods. This creates a subtle distortion. It is possible to imagine a world where Anunnaki language remains stable in ritual and scholarly contexts, but those contexts produced fewer tablets, or those tablets were copied less frequently, or their libraries were more vulnerable to loss. Meanwhile, temple and palace accounts continued to multiply. Over centuries, the gods who remain most visible are those who remain most useful to the machinery that produces clay. Documents every day. There is another quiet pressure embedded in these archives: the need for functional equivalence. A temple economy requires clarity. If an offering is due, the tablet must specify the recipient in a way that leaves no ambiguity. A collective term can be ambiguous. It may not indicate which shrine, which statue, which priest. Over time, scribal habits tend to favor names that resolve ambiguity. Even when a ritual might conceptually address a group of gods, the administrative note attached to the ritual might record the offerings under the name of the primary cult deity who hosts the rite. In this way, broader divine categories can become absorbed into the accounting structure of individual gods. This absorption may help explain a certain kind of silence. If the Anunnaki were treated as part of a larger divine order, and if temples increasingly expressed that order through the regular provisioning of major cult gods, then the older council could become less visible without needing to be rejected. It could remain as an assumed background to divine legitimacy, while daily religious life operated through institutions tied to specific temples and cities. The quieting, then, is not a dramatic event. It is a shift in documentary emphasis. The archive prefers what can be scheduled, provisioned, and supervised. The gods that dominate are those whose worship generates receipts. And when the surviving evidence is largely economic, the divine world begins to look like the temple's organizational chart. If this is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If older councils like the Anunnaki recede because they are not administratively practical, where do they go in the record? Into which genres, which rituals, which kinds of writing do they retreat? And how does that retreat reshape the way later scribes remember what divine authority once looked like? The last question narrows the search toward the places where writing is meant to endure. Temple accounting creates a vast paper trail, but it is not written for eternity. It is written for review, for settlement, for the next month's ledger. If the Anunnaki recede in that world because they are not administratively convenient, then the next evidence must come from a different kind of record, one produced less frequently, but designed to outlast the daily archive. In Mesopotamia, that durable register is often stone, statues, foundation deposits, brick inscriptions, and carved dedications that speak not to overseers but to memory. Unlike a ration tablet, a votive inscription assumes an audience beyond the immediate. It addresses gods, future rulers, and sometimes even the passerby who might later uncover it. It does not record barley or oil. It records devotion and legitimacy. It tells us which names rulers chose to set into durable materials, and therefore which divine authorities they considered worth preserving in the public record. In the early city-states of Sumer, dedicatory inscriptions are often humble in tone. A ruler offers a statue, a vessel, a weapon, or a piece of temple furniture to a deity. The text may be brief: a name, a title, the gift, and a formula of dedication. Yet even in their brevity, these inscriptions reveal a theology of place. The god is almost always tied to a specific city and temple. The devotion is directed not to a collective council, but to the deity who owns the sanctuary, who anchors the city's identity, and who provides the ruler's right to govern. The statues of early rulers from sites, like Lagash, are among the clearest examples. When a ruler, such as Gudea, commissions a statue and inscribes it, the writing emphasizes the relationship between king and temple god. The god is named, the temple is named, the building project is described with careful detail. The inscription behaves like a construction record as much as a devotional statement. It situates legitimacy in the act of restoration, repairing a shrine, renewing offerings, establishing order through building. In such texts, divine approval is not abstract. It is local and concrete. The god's favor is demonstrated by the successful completion of a temple. This is the first major clue about the Anunnaki's public silence. A collective council is not easily represented in a votive logic that depends on specificity. A votive gift is directed toward a statue, a shrine, and a cult image. A council does not have a single cult image, a single place where it is physically housed, a single temple where its presence can be stabilized through architecture. The Anunnaki, as a group, belong to the deeper structure of divine order, but votive inscriptions are largely designed to strengthen a ruler's bond with the god, whose temple stands inside the city walls. Foundation deposits deepen this pattern. When rulers lay bricks and placed deposits beneath temple corners, they often inscribed the name of the deity for whom the building is made, and the name of the ruler who funded it. These deposits are meant to be discovered by later builders, not by worshippers. They are messages across time, proof that the ruler served the god properly. The deity invoked is typically the temple's owner. The inscription becomes a legal claim. This ruler built this structure under this god's authority. Here again, collective councils have little place. The logic is proprietary and architectural. The god owns the space. The king restores it. The deposit testifies, as we move forward in time, into the great territorial states of Mesopotamia. Inscriptions begin to expand. Kings speak not only as local temple builders, but as rulers of multiple cities, multiple regions, and multiple peoples. Their inscriptions are longer, more programmatic, more concerned with conquest and universal legitimacy. Yet even as the political world grows, the divine world in inscriptions often narrows. The king's legitimacy is increasingly anchored in one dominant deity or a tight cluster of dynastic patrons. The logic becomes clearer. In a world where kings rule beyond a single city, they need a divine sponsor whose authority can also reach beyond a single city. This is where we begin to see the rise of theological centralization in public inscriptions. Enlil, as a god associated with Nippur and with the granting of kingship, becomes a central legitimizing figure for many dynasties. Later, in Babylonian contexts, Marduk takes on an increasingly dominant role, presented not merely as one god among many, but as the supreme authority whose favor defines rightful rule. These shifts are not only theological, they are political. A ruler's power is more stable if it can be framed as sanctioned by a universally recognized divine king. In such a setting, the Anunnaki rarely appear in royal inscriptions as an invoked authority, not because they are denied, but because they are diffuse. A king does not easily claim sponsorship from a council. Councils imply shared authority. Kingship ideology increasingly requires concentration. The king must present himself as chosen, authorized, and supported by a single high authority that stands above rivals. Invoking a broad assembly may weaken the rhetorical force. It distributes legitimacy rather than focusing it. The epigraphic record thus suggests an important transformation. The divine world becomes organized in public, writing around the needs of political narrative. Early dedicatory texts already privilege local temple gods. Later, royal inscriptions privilege higher universal gods. In both cases, the gods invoked are those that best anchor the king's legitimacy in a way that can be understood quickly and widely. The Anunnaki, as an assembly, do not offer that clarity. They belong to the deeper scaffolding of divine order, but kings do not build public legitimacy on scaffolding. They build it on pillars named gods with named temples, whose cults can be publicly seen. There are moments when collective gods appear in inscriptions, but often as generalized phrases: the great gods, the gods of heaven and earth, all the gods. These formulas function as gestures of completeness, ensuring that no divine authority is excluded. But even here, the Anunnaki are typically not singled out. The collective category becomes broad and unspecific, and the named gods remain central. What we may be watching, then, is not a disappearance, but a redistribution. The Anunnaki remain active in genres where councils matter: ritual, scholastic, underworld texts, while durable public inscriptions increasingly focus on gods who serve as visible legitimizers of rule. The stone remembers what power once remembered. It is an archive shaped not only by belief, but by political needs. And if stone inscriptions gradually stop naming older collective councils, because kingship legitimacy depends on more concentrated divine sponsors, then a quiet question follows. When rulers carve only certain divine names into lasting materials, does the public memory of the divine world itself begin to change until even the scribes who later copy the tablets inherit a cosmos where the oldest assemblies survive only in the margins? The question left by the stone record turns our attention upward, toward structures that were never meant to be hidden. If inscriptions preserve what rulers want remembered, architecture preserves what a city must live with every day. Buildings organize movement, sightlines, and ritual behavior. They shape how divinity is approached long before a word is read. And among Mesopotamian sacred forms, no structure reorganizes divine space more decisively than the ziggurat. The earliest temples of southern Mesopotamia were not towers. They were platforms, raised above the surrounding plain, emphasizing separation rather than ascent. These platforms marked sacred ground and protected shrines from flooding, but they did not yet insist on vertical symbolism. Over time, however, temple platforms grew taller and more articulated, developing into stepped structures that dominated the urban skyline. The ziggurat did not simply house a god. It staged a relationship between earth and sky. It transformed sacred space into an axis. This transformation carries theological weight. A ziggurat is not a neutral container. It enforces a particular cosmology through its form. The ascent from ground level to the summit shrine organizes ritual movement upward. The god associated with the ziggurat is encountered through elevation, distance, and controlled access. The structure teaches that divine authority descends from above, and that human approach must be gradual, mediated, and hierarchical. The city learns theology by walking it. In this architectural logic, the emphasis shifts. The vertical connection becomes central. The god of the temple is positioned above the city, both literally and symbolically. This is not the language of councils seated together, nor of underworld assemblies operating beneath the earth. It is the language of elevation, of singular presence, of a deity who occupies the highest point in the built environment. The city's sacred geography is reorganized around height rather than depth. This does not mean that the underworld disappears from belief, but it does mean that it becomes architecturally invisible. Underworld deities do not require towers. Their domains are not accessed through processional stairways. They belong to spaces that are ritually acknowledged rather than spatially in a city increasingly defined by its skyline. The gods who dominate public attention are those who can be placed at the top. The ziggurat also centralizes ritual. Its presence anchors festivals, processions, and offerings around a single focal point. Movement through the city often converges on the temple complex. This convergence reinforces the authority of the temple's primary deity and, by extension, the political authority aligned with that deity. The city's sacred life becomes more unified, more legible, and more easily managed. Architecture simplifies theology by making certain relationships unavoidable in earlier cosmological language. The divine world could be imagined as layered horizontally, assemblies, courts, and domains distributed across heaven, earth, and underworld. The ziggurat reorganizes that imagination vertically. It draws attention upward and away from the subterranean. The god who dwells at the summit becomes the primary mediator between heaven and earth. Other divine forces, including councils associated with fate or judgment, may still exist, but they are no longer architecturally foregrounded. Urbanism reinforces this shift. As cities expand and formalize their layouts, sacred precincts become more defined. The ziggurat complex often includes courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and administrative spaces. It is not only a place of worship, it is an institutional center. The god of the ziggurat presides over economic activity, labor organization, and ritual calendars. Divine authority is no longer distributed across multiple unseen realms. It is concentrated in a visible, elevated node that integrates theology with administration. This concentration has consequences for divine hierarchy. When one god is consistently placed above the city, both physically and ritually, that god's authority becomes intuitive. The population does not need to be taught that this deity is central. The city's form teaches it daily. Other divine figures may be acknowledged in texts and rites, but they do not command the same spatial dominance. Councils like the Anunnaki, whose authority is collective and often associated with judgment or the underworld, do not translate easily into this architectural grammar. The ziggurat also shapes memory. Buildings endure across generations. Even when rebuilt, they preserve orientation, footprint, and symbolic function. A city that grows up around a towering sacred structure inherits a particular theology simply by inheriting the streets and sightlines that lead to it. Over time, this can affect which divine narratives feel primary and which feel distant. Architecture does not argue. It assumes. It normalizes a hierarchy without needing to state it explicitly. This may help explain why certain divine categories become quieter in the record, as the sacred landscape becomes increasingly vertical and centralized. The need to name older, more distributed forms of divine authority diminishes. The Anunnaki do not vanish from belief, but their role becomes less aligned with the dominant architectural expression of the sacred. They belong to a cosmology that is not easily built in brick and stair. The city, in this sense, becomes a filter. It privileges gods who can be localized, monumentalized, and aligned with political power. It marginalizes those whose authority operates through less visible domains. The ziggurat does not deny the underworld. It simply does not display it. If architecture teaches theology through space and movement, then the rise of the ziggurat suggests a reorientation of divine attention from councils that govern beneath or beyond, towards singular presences elevated above the city. And if the built environment increasingly trains its inhabitants to look upward for authority, what happens to the divine institutions that once ruled from places the city no longer visibly acknowledges? The last implication leaves the city looking upward, trained by brick and stair to locate authority in elevation. But architecture only points. It does not measure. A ziggurat can stage the ascent to a god, yet it cannot tell a priest when the god's signs will appear, when the calendar must shift, or when a ritual must be performed to keep the year from slipping out of alignment. For that, Mesopotamia relied on a different kind of ascent, one not made in steps, but in observation. And in the long span of cuneiform tradition, it is here, in the patient work of watching the sky, that divine presence begins to change its texture. The gods remain, but their activity becomes increasingly legible as pattern. The earliest celestial references in Mesopotamian texts do not resemble modern astronomy. They are not written to explain the mechanics of the heavens. They are written because the sky is treated as a surface where decisions are posted. A star rising, a halo around the moon, a sudden dimming of light, these are not neutral phenomena. They are events in the administrative life of the cosmos, and they require interpretation. The interpretive tradition becomes, over centuries, increasingly systematic. It produces not only omens, but methods, lists, correlations, and rules that allow trained scribes to treat the sky as a structured archive. This is the beginning of a notable shift. In older divine assembly scenes, order is secured by councils convening, debating, decreeing. The narrative requires witnesses and deliberation because the world is imagined as contingent, something that must be decided and fixed into place. But in the astronomical texts that grow in volume and precision, order appears less as a verdict and more as a schedule. The sky behaves as if it has rules. The divine is still present, but it is present through regularity. The process begins in practical needs. The temple must know when to conduct festivals. Offerings depend on months and days. Agricultural work depends on seasons. A calendar that drifts creates administrative disorder. The priests and scribes responsible for this order become attentive to lunar cycles, solstices, equinoxes, and the predictable return of certain stars. Over time, they begin to record these observations with increasing detail. They do not describe them as mere natural cycles. They describe them as the motions of divine bodies, but the emphasis is no longer on whim. It is on consistency. In this tradition, the moon becomes a central instrument. Its phases define the month. Its visibility determines the beginning of each cycle. The appearance of the new crescent becomes an event that must be confirmed, recorded, and integrated into the calendar. The records treat the moon not only as a god, but as a timing authority. The moon's behavior dictates what is possible in the temple's schedule. When clouds obscure the crescent, the question is not simply astronomical. It is administrative. The scribes must decide how to maintain order despite incomplete evidence. In that decision-making process, the sky becomes a kind of text whose reading requires technique. The growth of omen series, such as those later standardized under titles like Entma, Anu, Enlil, shows how far this technique could go. These collections do not function like one-off prophecies. They are structured archives. They classify celestial phenomena into categories and link them to outcomes, political, environmental, dynastic. The omen is not merely a message. It is part of a reference system. The sky, in this sense, becomes a bureaucratic interface. It provides signals, and the scribes provide interpretation protocols. What matters for the Anunnaki is the form of authority implied by this system. In divine assembly literature, destinies are decreed by councils. Fate is the outcome of deliberation. In omen literature, destiny appears as correlation. If the moon is eclipsed on a particular day and in a particular direction, a certain kind of event may follow. The logic is not judicial. It is procedural. It suggests that the cosmos is already ordered in such a way that signs correspond to outcomes, and that the task of the human expert is to read those correspondences. This does not eliminate the gods. The gods remain the agents behind the signs, but their agency becomes rooted. It is expressed through stable patterns rather than narrative decisions. The divine world begins to resemble a regulated administration rather than an assembly in constant debate. A well-trained scribe can consult a tablet series and determine what a sign implies without invoking a council scene at all. The authority has shifted from an imagined gathering of gods to a corpus of written correlations, preserved in an archive at the same time. Observational texts begin to develop a more explicitly mathematical dimension. Diaries and records of celestial phenomena accumulate. Over generations, they allow scribes to anticipate patterns rather than merely record them. The motion of planets, the periodicity of eclipses, the length of months, these become subjects of calculation. Calculation does not replace divinity. It reframes it. A god whose movement can be predicted is still a god, but one whose behavior is regular enough to be treated as dependable. The divine becomes statistical, not because belief has weakened, but because record-keeping has deepened. This is a form of theology expressed through numbers. It implies that order is not renewed each time by a council decree. It is embedded in the fabric of the sky. The gods maintain that fabric, but they do so through continuity. The role of scribes becomes more prominent here. The temple expert is not merely a performer of rituals, but a manager of time. He preserves the stability of the year through observation and correction. In that role, the authority of the archive increases. The written series becomes a substitute for direct access to divine deliberation. This may be one reason older assemblies lose narrative necessity in certain contexts. If the world can be managed by reading the sky and applying established rules, the need to imagine a council convening for every decision diminishes. The Anunnaki, as a collective court, still have a conceptual place in the architecture of fate, but fate increasingly arrives in the form of scheduled phenomena. The divine court becomes less visible because the cosmos itself behaves like a lawful system. There is also a shift in where the sacred is located. In underworld texts, the Anunnaki sit beneath, associated with judgment and the dead. In the architecture of the ziggurat, the sacred is elevated. In astronomical tradition, the sacred becomes distributed across the entire sky. It is not localized in a single temple or a single council. It is everywhere, because the heavens are everywhere above the cities. This distribution favors categories of gods that can be mapped onto celestial bodies, moon, planets, fixed stars. It favors named deities whose identities can be tied to visible objects. Councils, by contrast, do not correspond to singular visible bodies. Their authority is harder to chart, and yet the tradition does not fully abandon the language of decree. Astronomical omens still speak in the register of fate and destiny. They still attribute meaning to the god's intentions, but the intention is inferred from patterns rather than narrated as an assembly. The god's decisions are treated as already encoded in signs. The witness is no longer the council. The witness is the sky itself. This creates an unusual kind of silence. The Anunnaki may not be denied. They may simply be bypassed. The scribal expert can operate without naming them, because the archive of celestial rules provides a different route to authority. When knowledge becomes strongly procedural, older collective names can become less necessary to mention. The divine world remains, but it is consulted through documents and calculations rather than through imagined councils. If the sky becomes a readable surface and the gods become increasingly expressed as schedules, omens, and numbers, then the question shifts again. When scribes learn to manage fate through the predictability of the heavens, what happens to the older institutions of judgment beneath the earth, and do councils like the Anunnaki become quiet because the cosmos no longer needs them to speak aloud? The last question leaves the heavens behaving like a ledger, signs posted in predictable cycles, interpreted through inherited rules. But the shift toward procedural order does not remain in the sky. It returns to the ground, into the hands of scribes and supervisors, into the daily work of measuring what belongs to whom. If celestial regularity made the cosmos readable, then measurement makes society readable. And in Mesopotamia, the tools of measurement become more than practical. They become a language of stability. They allow order to exist without constant narration. They allow the world to be managed as if it were already arranged. The earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia emerges alongside accounting. Before literature, before royal inscriptions, before lists of kings, there are tablets that hold quantities, grain counted, animals tallied, workdays recorded. These texts depend on standardized measures, and the measures themselves depend on agreement and shared units that can travel across households, temples, and cities. A unit of barley must mean the same thing to the scribe who records it and the overseer who distributes it. In that shared meaning, a new kind of authority is formed. The authority does not sit in an assembly. It sits in the unit. The sexagesimal system, the base 60 logic that becomes characteristic of Mesopotamian mathematics, does not arise as a theoretical invention. It arises as a solution to administrative needs, dividing fields, allocating rations, calculating labor obligations, measuring time. 60 is flexible. It can be divided many ways, allowing fractions to be expressed cleanly. This flexibility makes it useful in a world where distribution must be equitable and precise. Over centuries, the system becomes more than a tool. It becomes a habit of thought. It trains scribes to imagine the world as divisible, comparable, and commensurable. Once measurement becomes systematic, it begins to absorb functions that might otherwise require older forms of cosmic arbitration. In early ritual and underworld texts, uncertainty is managed through appeasement and procedure, offerings to the dead, invocations of divine councils, appeals to underworld judges. These texts presume that order can be threatened by forces that must be negotiated with. But measurement introduces another method. It allows order to be enforced through calculation and standardization. If a worker receives a ration according to a fixed scale, the scale itself replaces negotiation. If a field is measured and its yield estimated, distribution becomes predictable. The system, not the council, becomes the arbiter. This does not erase belief. It changes where belief must speak. In a society increasingly saturated with measurement, many disputes are resolved without invoking deep cosmic authority. A contract can specify obligations in measured quantities. A receipt can confirm delivery. A boundary can be marked with measured dimensions. These documents do not deny the gods. They often invoke them as witnesses, but their primary force lies in their precision. The gods guarantee the agreement, yet the agreement is already structured through units and totals. The human world becomes governable through mathematics. This mathematical governability affects how the cosmos is imagined as well. When time is measured through regularized months, when calendars are corrected through observation, when day lengths and seasonal cycles are tracked, the experience of order becomes increasingly impersonal. The gods remain the owners of the heavens, but the heavens behave with numerical reliability. In such a worldview, the deep gods, the primordial councils, the underworld assemblies can remain conceptually present, yet they no longer need to be named at every point of uncertainty. The system itself appears to carry the order forward. This is visible in the tablet genres that teach mathematics. Old Babylonian scribal schools preserve problem texts that describe field measurements, volume calculations, and distribution scenarios. These are not religious texts. but they belong to the same institutional environment as temple and palace archives. They train scribes to think in ratios, to solve for unknowns, to manage complexity through formula. The problems often describe real administrative situations. How much earth is needed to build a ramp? How to divide a field among heirs? How to calculate the capacity of a granary? The world is treated as an object that can be modeled. When the world can be modeled, the role of narrative shifts. Mythic explanations do not disappear, but they become less necessary for everyday governance. A flood may still be interpreted through divine displeasure, yet the response, rebuilding canals, measuring fields again, recalculating obligations, is handled through technical systems. In that response, authority is expressed through engineering and accounting rather than through assemblies of gods. This is a kind of quiet secularization, not in belief, but in function. The sacred continues to frame legitimacy, but the mechanics of order are carried by measurable systems. The Anunnaki, in many older texts, occupy the role of arbiters of destiny, judges of the underworld, members of the council that fixes outcomes. Their authority is collective and ultimate. But if outcomes in daily life are increasingly fixed by systems, by units, scales, and standardized procedures, then the need to invoke ultimate arbiters becomes less frequent. The Anunnaki may remain the deep background of fate, yet the surface world runs on measurable order. The gods who remain visible are those tied to the functioning of institutions, temple gods whose festivals are scheduled, city gods who guarantee kingship, celestial gods whose motions mark time. Councils that arbitrate in the depths are not absent, but they become less explicit because daily order no longer requires their constant mention. There is another subtle pressure here. Systems create redundancy. When units are standardized, many people can perform the same calculations. Authority becomes less dependent on individual charisma or personal divine favor and more dependent on shared technique. This technique is learned, repeated, and verified. It produces a culture where knowledge is preserved through method. In such a culture, the most sacred forms of order can become indistinguishable from the most practical ones. A calendar correction is both a ritual necessity and a mathematical operation. A temple offering is both a devotional act and an inventory transaction. The sacred is not removed. It is routinized. Routinization has consequences for older divine figures. Deep gods thrive in moments of unpredictability, catastrophe, death. Moral crisis where the world needs judgment rather than calculation. But as systems expand, unpredictability becomes increasingly managed. Even death is administered. Funerary offerings are standardized. Ancestor care is scheduled. Rites are assigned specific provisions. The underworld remains, but its handling becomes procedural. When procedure replaces crisis, the names tied to crisis can retreat. This is how numbers can replace myths, not by denying them, but by taking over their practical work. The Anunnaki, once prominent in texts that explain fate and judgment, may not vanish from thought, but they become less necessary as active narrative agents. Their functions are increasingly embedded in institutions that operate without needing to dramatize them. If Mesopotamian civilization gradually learns to carry order through measurement and units that can be repeated, verified, and transmitted, then the next question follows naturally. When a society builds fate into its procedures and authority into its calculations, where does the old divine court go, and what remains of the Anunnaki when their judgments no longer need to be spoken aloud? The last question rests on a quiet transformation. when order can be carried by units and procedures, judgment no longer needs to arrive as a story. It can arrive as a document. The arithmetic of distribution becomes the arithmetic of obligation, and obligation becomes something that can be recorded, witnessed, sealed, and enforced. In that environment, the most revealing tablets are no longer those that measure grain, but those that measure behavior. They show how a society gradually relocates the idea of judgment from the deep cosmos into the visible city. Some of the most durable legal texts from Mesopotamia are not dramatic in content. They are formulaic. They repeat the same phrases across hundreds of years because the purpose is not literary expression, but enforceable clarity. A contract tablet does not ask whether a deed is morally right in the eyes of the underworld. It specifies property, witnesses, terms, and penalties. It creates a small, enclosed universe where truth is what can be signed. This is not a denial of divine authority. Many contracts invoke gods as witnesses, but the practical work of judgment shifts. The tablet itself begins to function as the primary instrument of control. In earlier ritual and underworld contexts, divine councils like the Anunnaki appear as those who render ultimate decisions. Their court is the last resort when ordinary order fails, when spirits become restless, when destinies must be decreed, when the boundary between the living and the dead requires formal correction. But as Mesopotamian societies develop more elaborate systems of law, the need to imagine the divine court as constantly active in social life becomes less explicit. Disputes are processed through human institutions, elders, judges, assemblies, and later royal officials. The city becomes the visible court. The underworld becomes the ultimate background, no longer the daily stage. This shift can be traced through the growth of legal corpora. By the time we reach the Old Babylonian period, law collections attributed to rulers Uranama, Lipitishtar, Hammurabi stand as public declarations of order. These texts do not read like minutes from a divine council. They read like administrative architecture, organized clauses, standardized penalties, controlled language. Even when the prologues invoke divine sanction, the body of the text is concerned with regulating human conduct through predictable outcomes. The gods authorize the code. The code administers society. The structure is revealing. The legal collections often begin by placing the king in a relationship with a high god who grants authority to rule and to judge. The deity's role is to confer legitimacy, to call the king to righteousness, to establish him as a guarantor of order. The divine world remains present, but it is presented as a source rather than a forum. The king does not say that he gathered the Anunnaki and heard their decrees. He says that a god appointed him to establish justice in the land. The divine court is not described. It is presumed behind the king's mandate. What follows is a remarkable expression of social control through written procedure. The laws attempt to anticipate conflicts, property, disputes, theft, injury, marriage, inheritance, debt, slavery, and to assign outcomes that can be applied without improvisation. This is an important shift from the older imagination, where order is negotiated through divine assemblies and fate decrees. The code implies that social order can be stabilized by known rules. Judgment becomes less an act of cosmic deliberation and more an application of established categories. The everyday legal tablets reinforce the same principle. Contracts, sale documents, adoption records, marriage agreements, loan tablets. These texts present society as something made legible through writing. A field is transferred, a house is sold, a slave is hired, A debt is acknowledged, an heir is adopted. Each action is recorded with witnesses. Often a seal is rolled across the clay, adding a visual signature that is itself a claim to identity. The tablet becomes a durable substitute for memory. It stores obligation in a form that can be retrieved later, even after the parties have died. This has consequences for divine visibility. In many contracts, gods appear as witnesses, especially major city gods, but the Anunnaki rarely appear by name. Again, the question is not whether they have vanished from belief. It is whether the genre has room for them. Contracts require named deities whose authority is immediately recognizable in the city's religious landscape. A collective underworld council is less useful as a legal witness than a prominent temple god, whose cult statue stands nearby and whose authority is embedded in local identity. The contract does not need to invoke the deepest court. It needs to invoke the closest one at the same time. The legal system increasingly develops its own forms of enforcement that resemble the mechanisms of divine judgment. Oaths are sworn. Witnesses are listed. Curses are sometimes attached, threatening the violator with misfortune. These curses often invoke gods, but they also rely on human institutions to detect and punish transgression. The result is a layered system. Divine sanction frames legitimacy, but human courts process the case. The Anunnaki, as ultimate judges, remain conceptually present in the cosmology of punishment and fate. Yet they no longer need to appear in the daily paperwork of social control. There is also a subtle redefinition of wrongdoing. In older underworld contexts, disorder can be cosmic. A spirit is restless, a boundary is breached, a fate is misaligned. In legal texts, disorder becomes procedural. A contract is broken, a boundary moved, a witness falsified, a payment withheld. The problem is not resolved by appealing to the divine assembly. It is resolved by producing a tablet, presenting witnesses, and applying a known penalty. Justice becomes something that can be enacted without requiring mythic drama. The law does not eliminate the gods. It reduces the occasions when their counsels must be narrated. Even the language of judgment shifts. Terms for decision, case, witness, oath, and seal become the core vocabulary of authority. A judge's decision is recorded. A verdict is finalized. A penalty is assessed. The process resembles the older assembly scenes, but the actors are human. The courtroom has moved. The cosmic bureaucracy is echoed in earthly bureaucracy, and in the echo, the older divine court becomes less visible. The growing dominance of royal authority intensifies this effect. As kingdoms expand, the king becomes the focal point of justice. Legal codes present the ruler as a provider of fairness, a protector of the weak, a stabilizer of the land. The king's judgments are framed as extensions of divine will, but they are enacted through human administration. In this arrangement, divine councils do not need to be invoked as independent authorities. The king can claim to embody the sanctioned order. The divine court becomes compressed into the concept of kingship itself. This may explain why certain older divine categories retreat in public and legal registers. A collective assembly, like the Anunnaki, implies distributed authority and deliberation. But state law and royal justice favor centralization. They prefer a hierarchy that can be represented as a single chain. God authorizes king. King authorizes judges. Judges authorize verdicts. The deeper councils may still exist, but their function is increasingly carried by earthly institutions. The mythic court is not abolished. It is imitated, and in being imitated, it becomes less necessary to name. Yet the imitation leaves a trace of its origin. Legal texts still depend on the idea that verdicts are not merely human agreements, but alignments with an order larger than any one person. Even when gods are not listed, the format of the tablet witnesses seals. Formal language suggests a society that believes judgment must be witnessed in a way that resembles divine oversight. The law tablet is, in a sense, a small model of the cosmos, structured, witnessed, and fixed. If human courts increasingly administered justice through written procedures and predictable penalties, then the Anunnaki's court becomes quieter, not because judgment has ended, but because judgment has been relocated. And if that relocation is real, then the next question becomes almost inevitable. When human institutions begin to perform the work once imagined as the domain of divine assemblies, do the gods retreat into the background of legitimacy, or do they reappear elsewhere? In genres where law and measurement cannot fully contain what still feels uncertain, the last question leaves a narrow space where the law cannot reach. A contract can define obligation, a code can assign penalties, a court can issue verdicts, but none of these can guarantee health. Even in a society where judgment has been relocated into human institutions, the body remains uncertain territory. Pain arrives without witnesses. Fever disrupts without clear cause. And the archive that forms around illness is therefore different from the archive of property or punishment. It is closer to ritual, yet it is also technical. It attempts to name what cannot be fully measured. Mesopotamian healing texts, diagnostic tablets, therapeutic prescriptions, incantations, ritual instructions do not treat sickness as a single phenomenon. They treat it as a field of signs. The healer is trained not only to apply remedies, but to interpret symptoms as if they were written on the body. The tablets describe how to observe the patient, how to categorize what is seen, and what implications those categories carry. In this world, suffering becomes a language with its own grammar, and the gods appear not as distant arbiters of fate, but as forces embedded in the vocabulary of misfortune. A diagnostic series, such as the one associated with Isujul Apli, later known under the title Sa, presents illness as a structured set of possibilities. The text lists symptoms, sequences, and outcomes, sometimes with striking confidence and sometimes with careful uncertainty. It is not a hymn. It is a manual. It assumes that misfortune can be classified and that classification can guide response. Yet the classifications are not purely physiological. They often point outward toward the divine world, toward omens, toward unseen causes. A symptom can imply the presence of a god's displeasure, the touch of a demon, or the consequence of a taboo violated. The body is read as a site where the larger order leaves traces. Here, the question of the Anunnaki becomes practical. If the Anunnaki once appeared as judges and decrees, one might expect them to surface where suffering demands explanation and where judgment still seems relevant. But in the medical and therapeutic record, the language shifts. The texts more often invoke named deities associated with healing, such as La, Ninazu, Nintanagor, appeal to personal gods and protective spirits. They often describe demons, ghosts, and malevolent forces. Lamoktu, Asaku, the Utaku, the Giddim, the hand of a god. Misfortune is framed as contact. Something has seized, struck, entered, or lingered. This vocabulary suggests a reallocation of responsibility. Instead of a collective court determining fate, illness is treated as an encounter with specific agents. The hand of a god is an especially revealing expression. It does not require the gods' assembly. It implies direct impact and affliction that belongs to a deity's domain. A fever may be the hand of Nergal, a seizure may be the hand of a ghost, a wasting illness may be the hand of Istar. These are not casual metaphors. In the medical archive, they function as diagnostic categories. To name the divine hand is to define the nature of the problem and therefore the appropriate ritual countermeasure. The Anunnaki, when they appear at all in these contexts, tend to appear indirectly, as part of the underworld structure that explains certain forms of persistent misfortune. Ghost-related illnesses, for instance, are treated as administrative failures of the dead. A restless spirit may be suffering from neglect, from improper burial, from lack of offerings, or from unresolved obligations. In such cases, the underworld is not merely a place of judgment, but a system of management. The living must restore order through rites, offerings, libations, prayers, sometimes the symbolic transfer of food and water to the dead. The goal is not to defeat the ghost, but to reintegrate it into the proper economy of the underworld, even here. However, the texts tend to address more immediate authorities, the queen of the underworld, the gatekeepers, the specific gods associated with death and transition. The Anunnaki remain the implied counsel behind the system, but the healer's ritual language does not necessarily require their name. What matters is not the highest court, but the officials whose jurisdiction touches the patient's crisis. The ritual becomes a form of casework. Identify the agent, address the relevant authority, perform the proper procedure. This is a distinctive form of divine bureaucracy, but it is not expressed as assembly narrative. It is expressed as correspondence. The incantation speaks to particular gods, invokes particular names, uses standard formulas that function like petitions. The healer's work resembles a careful negotiation with a layered, unseen administration, and over time, the archive of incantations becomes immense structured, copied, standardized. In that standardization, certain divine names become dominant because they are effective within the ritual logic, while broader collective counsels recede because they are not required for precision. There is another shift as well, the growth of the personal god as a stabilizing concept. Many Mesopotamian texts, especially prayers and laments, assume that each person stands under the care of a personal deity, a kind of intimate patron who can protect, intercede, or withdraw. When illness strikes, it may be interpreted as the withdrawal of that personal god, leaving the person exposed to hostile forces. In such a framework, responsibility for suffering is not assigned to a distant council. It is experienced as a change in personal divine proximity. The solution is therefore relational. Restore the bond. Confess ignorance. Request return. Perform rites of appeasement. This personal theology subtly competes with the idea of a grand collective court. A council like the Anunnaki belongs to the deep structure of destiny, but the personal God belongs to the daily structure of vulnerability. In illness, people do not always need a cosmological explanation. They need an advocate. The personal God can function as that advocate. The language of healing reflects this need. Many prayers ask a God to turn his face back, to remove the affliction, to restore balance. The emphasis is on restoring favor, not on appealing a verdict issued by an assembly. At the same time, demonology expands. Illness is frequently associated with specific hostile beings whose identities are catalogued and whose behaviors are known through tradition. Lamaktu threatens infants and mothers. Pazuzu can repel her. Asaku brings fever. Ghosts bring wasting and anxiety. These beings are treated almost like known hazards. The healer's texts offer countermeasures, amulets, figurines, fumigations, spoken formulas, and offerings. Again, the logic is not that a council must be convened. The logic is that the correct ritual technology must be applied. Ritual technology is itself a form of inherited knowledge. Many incantations emphasize antiquity, repeating old formulas, invoking ancient divine authority, and using language that would have sounded archaic even to later scribes. This is memory as medicine. The healers treat words as preserved instruments. The older the formula, the more legitimate it may feel. Yet even as the ritual language preserves ancient structures, it chooses specific names. It selects which authorities are operational in the procedure. The Anunnaki, despite their deep status, are often not operational in the immediate therapeutic action. Their court does not administer a fever. Their assembly does not remove a demon. The healer works with deities and spirits that operate closer to the surface. This is not a disappearance. It is a reclassification of relevance. The Anunnaki may remain as the ultimate underworld council, but the lived experience of sickness draws on a different set of divine actors: healing goddesses, personal patrons, protective spirits, and hostile demons. The archive of medicine, therefore, becomes one of the places where we can watch how suffering reorganizes theology. The forces that are named most often are those that can be engaged directly through ritual procedure.
And this raises a quiet implication. If older councils reseed in the genres of law because human courts take over, and if they reseed in the genres of healing because illness is handled through a different ritual vocabulary, then their silence begins to look less like a disappearance and more like a specialization. They remain in the deep background, presiding over ultimate boundaries, while daily life is managed by nearer divine offices. But if that is true, then a question becomes unavoidable. When a civilization learns to treat misfortune through technical systems, contracts for disputes, prescriptions for illness, incantations for fear, what kind of divine authority remains necessary to name, and what kind becomes so assumed that it no longer needs to speak? If the Anunnaki become assumed rather than invoked, their absence may begin not in temples or courts, but in the classroom. Mesopotamian writing was not learned privately. It was taught through a disciplined progression of exercises, copied day after day on clay tablets that were often discarded once the lesson was complete. The survival of any tradition depended on this repetition. What a student copied became what a culture remembered. The earliest stages of scribal training focused on signs, then on lists, professions, animals, plants, cities, and gods. These lists did not merely teach vocabulary. They taught how the universe was arranged. A god placed high in a list was reinforced as central. A god omitted was not argued against, but quietly excluded from daily practice. Over time, the curriculum itself became a filter. Some compositions were copied endlessly, hymns, proverbs, model contracts, while others became rare, preserved only in specialist libraries or not at all. Copying was also editing. A scribe could modernize spellings, substitute terms, condense older categories into newer ones, and align ancient texts with contemporary theology without announcing the change. In such conditions, disappearance does not require rejection. It requires only that a term stops being taught. And if the Anunnaki belonged most strongly to older ritual and underworld registers, then their fading may reflect not a shift in belief, but a shift in what young scribes were trained to write, until the council remained only where the curriculum still allowed it to survive. By the time the scribal curriculum narrows what is remembered, the pattern is no longer unique to Mesopotamia. Other early civilizations preserve traces of similar processes, where older divine figures do not vanish abruptly but are gradually absorbed, renamed, or repositioned as systems of authority mature. In Egypt, primordial deities associated with creation and deep time give way, in public inscriptions, to state-centered gods who legitimize kingship and ritual order. In early Anatolia and the Levant, collective divine groups yield prominence to city gods and dynastic patrons as political organization stabilizes. These parallels do not require shared origin or transmission. They suggest a common pressure. Archives favor what institutions can support. When administration, law, and education become standardized, older divine categories tied to less visible domains often retreat into specialist traditions or mythic memory. Their disappearance from dominant records reflects selection rather than erasure. Seen this way, the Anunnaki's fading is not an anomaly. It resembles a broader pattern in how civilizations remember their deepest gods, by no longer needing to name them everywhere, once their authority has been embedded into systems that carry order forward without invoking its oldest architects. By the end of the archive, what remains most striking is not a final statement, but a thinning of explicit language. The Anunnaki do not exit the record with a farewell. They recede as councils recede, as categories compress, as institutions favor the names that can be anchored to temples, dynasties, calendars, and classrooms. The disappearance is therefore not an event that can be dated. It is a change in what the surviving texts choose to make visible. This is where historical method becomes the final evidence. A civilization's silence can be produced by collapse, by loss of libraries, by shifts in scribal fashion, by political centralization, or by the simple exhaustion of copying. Absence in the record is never neutral. It is shaped by what survives, and survival is shaped by what is used. The Anunnaki may have remained present as a deep assumption, an inherited architecture beneath law, ritual, and kingship, while the documents that named them became less necessary to produce. So the investigation ends where it began, in the space between what the tablets say and what they stop saying. If a divine council can fade not because it left, but because the world learned to function without naming it, then the question is no longer why the Anunnaki disappeared, only what it means when a civilization's oldest authorities become so fundamental that they no longer need to be written at all.